Well, well, well. Hey, Sanchan. I know I'm a little late. Who else is on? Who's on YouTube? Angel. Hey there. How are we doing, you all? I'm sorry for being late. I had a I had a conference call that ran just a little bit over. Hey, Betty. I'll give it a couple more minutes. We'll get started. Well, looks like we have an exclusive group, huh? Yeah. The weather's warm. Despite being sheltered in place, we're out enjoying the sun. Let me ask it, what those of you on Angel, Betty, Sanchan, are you any of you going to be involved in any Juneteenth celebration remembrances, um any Juneteenth activities this Friday or this weekend? Type them in. What you doing for Juneteenth? Juneteenth. Hmm. No plans. No, I don't have no suggestions. Marquette. Oh, Hidden Lake's got something going on? I didn't know. Angel Sanchan said Marquette and Hidden Lake will have some celebrations Juneteenth. Hey Joan. Hey Ruthie Fordham. Jerome. Those of you who just tuned in, I was trying to see, are you all going to attend any Juneteenth activities this Friday or anytime this weekend? Um, there's some things going on at Marquette. I'm just been told by Sanchan and Hidden Lake. Anybody have any other Juneteenth celebrations that you know of? Come on, type them in. Okay, Joan, no problem. Okay, thanks, Sanchan. I'll be looking for it. Hey there, Jerome. What you doing for Juneteenth, man? Oh, Betty, you got work going on. Marika's here? Please give her a big hug for me, Betty. Absolutely. Well, let's see if we can get started. If you don't mind, let's pause, have a word of prayer. Dear God, we thank you for this time. Thank you for technology. Thank you for those who are viewing via Facebook or via the YouTube. Now bless them where they are and guide us as always. Give us some encouragement, some inspiration. Give us, oh God, some wisdom and clarity. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. No plans yet, Annette Williams. All right. Hey, Kathleen. So actually that's what I wanted to us to kind of talk about today is Juneteenth. Um everybody familiar with Juneteenth? Why is Juneteenth popular? And where it hey Marika. Everybody familiar with Juneteenth? Um okay. Got you, Jerome. So Juneteenth is unique because of um of how it actually comes about. Okay, Kathleen, yeah, you lived in Texas. Okay, great. Yeah, yeah. You know what is so fascinating is how it gained popularity. Um, because as many of you already probably know, in 1861, the Civil War began, and the Civil War was primarily about slavery in America. And love you too, Marika. It was primarily about slavery, the institution of slavery. And absolutely. And so when I say it was primarily about the institution of slavery, remember that the southern states were able to to progress financially um, far beyond the northern states because the southern states had the majority of enslaved Africans. We'll come back to that. That northern states had them also, but it was primarily about enslaved Africans, but it was more about economics. And so Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War is started around 1862. New Orleans is occupied by the Union troops, and many of the slaveholders in New Orleans they migrated or ran off to Texas because of what was going on. Hey, brother Robert Gordon and Rita. So many of the slave holders in New Orleans then went to and took their slaves to Texas because in 1862 the Union troops marched in and took control of New Orleans. 1863, uh, the Emancipation Proclamation is signed. Well, 1862 September it's signed. 1863 January 1st it goes into effect. What is interesting, and the book that that documents this the best for me is the late Lerone Bennett Jr.'s book, Forced into Glory, where he demystifies. Oh, no, that's the wrong term. He accurately takes the heroism off of Abraham Lincoln, because he demonstrates in Abraham Lincoln's own words that Abraham Lincoln did not think that black people and white people were were equal. He didn't think they were equal, and his goal was not to actually free black people. His first mind was to have a study done to see if they could send all black people back to Africa. Abraham Lincoln first did a study to see what it would take to send black people back to Africa, because he did not believe in the inherent equality of black and white. And as the war pressed on, it got to the point where he had to press forward with defeating the South. And so he comes up with the Emancipation Proclamation, but the wording of it is strategic, y'all. The wording of the Emancipation Proclamation was very strategic in that it said that enslaved people residing in the rebelling Confederate States to be thenceforward and forever free. So he didn't mention, when you read the Emancipation Proclamation, and when we do watch service, y'all know I put it into the bulletin for this reason, so that you can read it yourself. And it doesn't mention the border states, of the border southern states that had not seceded. Many of the southern states had seceded from the Union, but there were border states that had not seceded, and they were still holding slaves. And then there were northern states that were holding slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation does not address the border states or the northern states. And the reason being, Johnson did not want to upset the border states that did not secede, because he didn't want them to then join with the Confederates. And so even though they had slaves, he didn't care. So the Emancipation Proclamation only addressed the rebellious traitors of the southern states that had seceded from the Union. It did not apply to the roughly 425,000 enslaved people living in Tennessee, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland. These states had not seceded, but it didn't address them. And so the Emancipation Proclamation, in effect, did not free one slave. The southern traitor states that seceded refused to give up. And so the border states and the northern states that had not seceded, they weren't even addressed in the Emancipation Proclamation. So because of that, we have to tell the truth about history, that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free one slave. Okay, but the war was being fought because it was splitting the country, and Johnson was trying to unify the country. So the codification of the Emancipation came in December of 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. That was December of 1865. Remember, Juneteenth is celebrated June 19th of 1865. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation happened. And then in 1865, Union troops go into Galveston, Texas, June of 1865. They go down to Galveston, and General Granger reads his order number 3, which basically says that you can't hold slaves anymore. It ended. Everybody's supposed to be equal. The problem with even then, and Kathleen, you lived in Texas. The problem even then was if you didn't have federal troops around every plantation, then the plantation owners would keep the slave anyway. And so even after June 19th, plantation owners said, we're going to get the crops in. Hey, Marie, Ray. And so even Juneteenth, after that, there were still places in Texas that held slaves. As long as there were no Union troops around, slave owners continued to use people as property. And so in December of 1865, the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which then specifically prohibited chattel slavery throughout the United States, except as punishment for a crime. Slavery has never ended in this country, because if one is incarcerated, one can then be used as a slave. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution prohibited chattel slavery except for punishment for a crime. Stick a pin there. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. Now, even with the 13th Amendment, so get this now. We gotta walk through this. You have the Civil War being fought. Then you have the Emancipation Proclamation, neither of which frees anybody. Then you have the 13th Amendment, which then frees a bunch of people, but states that still did not comply with the 13th Amendment, Delaware, it didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 1901. It gets better. Oh, well, it gets worse. Kentucky didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 1976. It gets worse. Mississippi didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 1995. Did you hear me? So even though the 13th Amendment is supposed to be the law of the land, slavery, chattel slavery is abolished. 13th Amendment. Delaware didn't ratify until 1901. Kentucky didn't ratify until 1976. Mississippi didn't ratify it until 1995. And to add to that, you have to remember that even though on paper chattel slavery is abolished, there was nothing ever done to address the myth of racial hierarchy that had actually sustained chattel slavery in this country. So there was never anything done to address the myth that many white people in particular, and then some black people, had drilled into them, indelibly etched upon them, that whites were higher on the scale than black people. This was the foundational teaching, the foundational mindset of people in this nation. And so even though on paper it's saying chattel slavery is abolished, there was nothing, not one thing ever done to address that there was a myth that was the foundation of this, and there was no commitment to an alternative ideology of racial equality. So there was no money, there was no push, there was no fight, there was no campaign, there was nothing that was done to then add to the paper documents that said people of African ancestry are equal to white people. And so without that, Southern whites in particular, and white people in general in this country still don't recognize black people as equal. That is the substance, of the struggle that it's a myth that black folk are not equal to white people. So President Johnson, who was the vice president under Abraham Lincoln, President Johnson, who was a former slave holder himself, he initially promised that the Southern traders, this is this language, that the Southern traders, the states that had seceded, he initially promised to punish the Southern traitors, but instead he issued over 7,000 pardons to the secessionists in 1866, by 1866. He then rescinded the orders granting black farmers tracts of land from the confiscated land from the Confederate states. So the Union Army had confiscated a lot of Confederate land, and it had been promised that the freed blacks would get tracts of land so that they then could start their life. Because you are on paper, you're free, you leave a plantation, what do you do now? You got to have some land so that you can make a living for yourself, for your family. And so the government initially promised land. That's where you get 40 acres and a mule from. It was initially promised to freed Africans in the South, 40 acres and a mule, so that you could then begin to control your own destiny by owning your own property and building up your property and supporting yourself financially. Well, President Johnson rescinded all of that. He took it away. Swipe of a pen. He took away the promise to grant to black farmers tracts of land, and in doing that, he really impeded. Hey, Isla. In doing that, I want you to see. You got to see the structure of racism here. It is in the system. So, in taking away the promise to grant tracts of land to black farmers who were now supposed to be free, he impeded black farmers from building their farms because whites refused to provide credit to buy property, to buy equipment, thus barring black farmers from purchasing land without the government's assistance, and the government was resistant to do it. So therefore, structurally, you are damning and dooming people to poverty because there is nowhere to turn. And then President Johnson opposed black voting rights. And he allowed the white states to declare voting as a privilege and not a universal right. So therefore, the white southern states in particular and northern states were then able to determine and demand that voting be a right, a privilege rather, of only certain people and not black people. So you get those stupid games of how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, how many beans are in a jelly bean jar and stuff like that. Or you just get outright, you ain't gonna vote here, and things like that. And also 1866, right after 1865, you have the black codes that are instituted in the South. The black codes were instituted strictly for black people. And the black codes, these are laws that were enacted subjecting black people to criminal prosecution for things like loitering, vagrancy, and breaking the curfew. No three black persons could gather together anywhere without a white person present. If they did, they could be arrested. That was the black codes. Black people could be arrested and incarcerated for loitering, vagrancy, breaking curfew, and other things like that. Now, remember what I said about the 13th Amendment, that it prohibited slavery except for criminal punishment. Okay? So what the southern states were doing then is rounding up black people who didn't have a job because white folk wouldn't hire them because there were no black farms to go to because President Johnson didn't. President Johnson pulled back on the promise to black farmers. So you had a lot of black men in particular, but black women who were unemployed, vagrancy, and many were what you would call loitering, but hanging out, trying to figure out and talk to one another about what we're going to do. They get rounded up. And then arbitrary curfew that would only apply to black people, they get rounded up. And then they get put on chain gangs, and the chain gangs work for the white plantations. They get put on plantations to work again for free. So slavery still never ended. Slavery still never ended. And so you have the Civil War fought. You have the Emancipation Proclamation, neither of which frees anybody. You have the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which then abolishes slavery except for criminal prosecution and punishment. And you have white slave owners who are basically, in white states, well, you have states that are basically ignoring the 13th Amendment because they are saying black people are not equal to white people. And so then you have the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which then declares that blacks are full citizens. And so that's where you get this thing where the current occupant and his group, these Confederate folk, are talking about anchor babies. And they're talking about people coming from Mexico and other places, and they get to American soil and they have a child. And then the child, because the child is born in America, the child is automatically a citizen of America. Well, it started with the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment actually was instituted because white people, and particularly in the South, but all over, including Abraham Lincoln, including President Johnson, including just about, all of the white legislators, did not believe that black folk were full citizens because they didn't believe black folk were equal to white people. And so the 14th Amendment then declares that black people are full citizens. Incidentally, President Johnson vetoed it. The 14th Amendment, President Johnson vetoed it. But it was the first time in history that it was overridden. So it was overridden. So you have the 14th Amendment. You have the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act, and then the 14th Amendment, which said that all citizens, regardless of race, are entitled to the same privileges. But incidentally, concurrently with all of this, the organization, the forming of the Ku Klux Klan started in 1865 with 6 Confederate veterans. They formed the KKK in Pulaski, Tennessee, and it blew up. The chapter spread all over the nation. And so the KKK were formed because black folk were competing with white folk for labor jobs like carpentry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Black folk were competing with whites because black folk had learned these things in chattel slavery. They were forced to do all these things. Now they're competing with whites for these positions, and whites didn't want the competition. And so, and they're competing with whites voting. So there were way more, oftentimes, blacks in a particular area of the South than there were whites. And so if blacks would vote, then they could vote and be the deciding factor in many elections. And so the KKK were formed to terrorize black people so that they would not be seeking jobs and would not be seeking to vote in this country. And lynching became a thing that was common. And so the KKK, in initiating this lynching campaign, please understand that by the 1880s, 1 in 5 white males were in the Klan. By the 1880s, 1 in 5 white males were in the Klan. Between 1880 and 1890, one person was lynched every other day in America. Are y'all listening to me? Between 1880 and 1890, one black person was lynched every other day in America. From 1880 to 1968, 4,700 people were lynched. One person was lynched a week for 88 years. These are only the people that we know of. These are only the ones that we know of. A couple years ago, I visited the lynching museum in Montgomery, Alabama, and it will take your breath away as you look at the thousands of monuments to Black people who have been lynched in this country, in the South and in the North. So please get this. From 1880 to 1968, 4,700 Black people were lynched. One person was lynched a week for 88 years, and nobody was ever prosecuted for it. So it is a testament of courage, a testament of tenacity, and a faith in a God who has all power, that people in Galveston, Texas, and then all throughout Texas decided that they were going to celebrate Liberation Day and call it Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. Because Granger gives the announcement, Galveston, Texas, that slavery is over, but they knew it wasn't over. And as Kathleen can attest from living in Texas, white people harassed Black people for celebrating Juneteenth in its beginning. But Black people would not give up. Black people would not lay down. They continued to celebrate Juneteenth despite not being allowed to go certain places to celebrate it. So they had to go by the creek, by the river, and they would celebrate Juneteenth, y'all. This is nothing but a testimony to the courage and tenacity of our people, and that blood runs through your veins too. And so, as Annette Williams said, yes, this is the bloodstream of America. This is why you see what is going on now. White police officers in particular, who have in their system that Black people are not equal to them, and Black people in this nation who make apologies for them also don't believe that Black people are equal to white people. This is the foundation of this America KKK. It's in the bloodstream, and it has never left because it has never been addressed. And so I was on a conference call just before I got on, which is why I was late. And I was addressing a mostly white group who were willing to have this conversation. And I had to, and I was giving them what I'm giving you, the history that most of them, just about all of them, did not know. That this thing is in the bloodstream. And Isla, I recommended to them the documentary that you shared with me, which is an awesome documentary, The Uncomfortable Truth, and you can look at it on Prime, because this white gentleman, Loki Mulholland, he gives one of the most intimate and vulnerable assessments of himself and his own family. And despite him being a progressive and his mother being one of the freedom riders, he points out that the residual racism that still resides in him. And that's what I shared with the white folk on the phone before I got on this. I was sharing with them that there's residual racism in you. And incidentally, black folk, I forgot the comedian. I think it was Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy said one time that he has had an office at Paramount Studios. And this was years ago. He said he had two black folk. I forgot the names of them. You would know them if I called the name. I just can't remember the name. They were in his office and they started talking about racism in America. He said, now he's in his own office and they started talking about racism in America. And he says all of them started whispering as they talked about white supremacy and racism. They started lowering their voice, whispering to one another. And Eddie Murphy said, this is a damn shame. He said, we're in my office. And here we are, black people. And because we're on the lot of Paramount Pictures, we start talking in whispers about white racism. And y'all have done it too. All of us have done it. I check myself when I'm out and I'm having a conversation, whether it's at a restaurant or wherever, and I'm talking with somebody about racism, and they start to, whispering about, white people. And I check it. I say, no, we're gonna talk like we normally talk. And that what I'm trying to show you is, and it is ingrained, it's in the bloodstream of America, this racist history. And so, so when we see what is happening today, it is a culmination of decades upon decades upon decades of a structural nature to the racism. And so on that call, I was sharing with one of the white guys so that he understood that you benefited from a lack of competition because black folk were systemically structured out of the mix, so you didn't have any competition. And so even though you can say that, I've never oppressed anybody, I don't do that and stuff, you benefited because the structure was set up for you. And he even shared with me how his parents grew up dirt poor. And I said, a dirt poor white person and a dirt poor black person, the dirt poor white person has still more privileges than the dirt poor black person. So I said, even in the dirt poorness of poverty, because of the structure of America, a dirt poor white person has more privilege than a dirt poor black person. Because it's in the structure, in the system. And when the country was founded on a myth that black people were unintelligent and not equal to white people, that is passed down. And so now we see what we are seeing, which is a culmination. And so periodically it's like a pressure cooker. The pressure cooker has to have that outlet so that steam can escape, and we have the rebellions that we're having now. It gets to the point where people say, you know what, we stomach enough. And to add to that, remember, we're sheltered in place now. And so we have no choice but to see the horrendous things that are happening every day. So George Floyd's situation was nothing new. Jay Farrell talks about one officer put a knee in his neck. This is a practice that was common. And there were black folk who had died from it. Breonna Taylor is not the only black person, black woman to have the police not bust into place and start shooting. All you got to do is go back to Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, and more than that. But what is happening now, we're sheltered in place, and we are captured audiences. Also, guess what? There's no sports on. So you can't tune out and watch sports. There's nothing else going on. And so we're forced to deal with the issue that is the most important issue to address in this nation. Some people would say it's money. Black folk need to get more money. If we start pooling our resources together and this or that, and that is part of the truth. Black folk got to do better with how we support one another financially. We got to do better. But we have to deal with the issue of race, because you're going to have to exist in the same place of your oppressor. And as long as your oppressors see you as less than, no matter how much money you have, you still are going to be oppressed. Kathleen says when she first got to Texas in 1985, she was a Yankee, and some black people there still shuffled. And no black arts, no real black programming. The news media show their prejudice. Exactly. And see, this is until we deal with the issue of race and the myth of inferiority of black people, the myth that black people don't have history. So I have a brother, he hates to watch movies that deal with slavery. And I get it. He hates to watch movies that deal with slavery. He said we've had enough of it. And I tell him, no, we haven't had enough of it, because we've only had a few movies. So I asked him, count the number of movies that deal with slavery on your hand. And you can only talk about 3 or 4. But I said, I agree with you. We do need to have more teaching, and not just movies, but more teachings, more discussions, more studies about the greatness of African people, period. That we are the ones who gave the world Christianity. Now, y'all know I get in trouble with this, because there are black folk all over in this city, in Chicago, all over, who have a hissy fit because I want to point out that slavery didn't start with white people. I mean, that Christianity did not start with white people. Black people gave white people Christianity. Jesus was a black African man. The disciples were black African people, male and female, incidentally. The religion of Judaism, of Christianity, and Islam were African religions. These religions were given to other people by black people. They were by black people given to other people. African people were the major people on the planet for over 10,000 years. We taught the world all of the disciplines. So we've got to dismantle the myth in our minds and in other people's minds of black inferiority. And in dismantling that myth, then we as a collective group can organize ourselves for economic and political, educational, and all of that parity with others. But the myth has never been addressed in this nation, and so we face some very challenging times. I see. I mean, when I'm hesitating because I constantly get in trouble for talking like this. But the black church has been the place for rebellion, where from chattel slavery, the black church was the place that was one of the way stations for the Underground Railroad. And there were white churches too, but the black church was the way station. There are hundreds and thousands of stories that, black preachers, when the white slave owner was around, had to preach, slave, be obedient to your masters. But most of those black preachers, when the slave owner wasn't around, the black preacher would then say, you forget everything I just said. Now let me tell you what the truth is. And so there was always among black people, even in chattel slavery, a subversive spirituality that ran through. Now, the problem was there were black folk who, like Kathleen points out, who who Kathleen pointed out, who lived in Texas, some who lived in some parts of Texas and other parts of this nation, some black people who could not embrace their own greatness. And so when you look at the three big slave rebellions, there were hundreds, but the big slave rebellions, that one was organized by Reverend Gabriel Prosser in Richmond, Virginia in 1800. It was a slave rebellion that started with the black church and a black preacher, Reverend Gabriel Prosser in 1800, Richmond, Virginia. And then another of the big three in 1822 in Charleston, South Carolina, an AME steward, a steward in the AME church, a brother by the name of Denmark Vesey, organized another major slave rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina, 1822. And then the biggest of the big three was organized by Reverend Nathaniel Turner, Nat Turner, Reverend Nat Turner in 1831 in Southampton, Virginia. Now, what do these slave rebellions all have in common? They have in common that they were all stopped before they could fully do what they were intended to do, because a black person ran back to Massa and said, let me tell you what the darkies are doing. All three, there were a black person or some black people who told on the black folk who were organizing the rebellion. So we've got to deal with, our own people. And right now there are black folk in black churches, there are black pastors who don't like Black Lives Matter. I've seen it in this city, I've seen it in other cities. There are black pastors and black people in churches who don't like Black Lives Matter. For those of you, the Facebook has come back. Okay. Yeah, there are black folk who have a problem in this city and other cities who are church people and who are pastors, and they can't work with Black Lives Matter, and they're always talking down. Seen it happen a week ago. And so one of that, I mean, and the problem is this: they don't recognize the agency and the activism that black folk have. And so I want to wrap up. That's why I've gone through so much of Acts of the Apostles, showing how the church, black people, roam with white people. I've gone through so much, in detail trying to do that. I know most folk want to hear something else, but I was just, the Spirit guided me to show the connections to the church started in activism against white supremacy in the first century of Rome, white supremacy in the 21st century, American KKK, and Britain and France, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that we will do something. You'll be involved somehow with some type of, yeah, you're right, Isla. In fact, Dr. King was supposed to come to Gary, but there was a group of black folk in Gary who told Dr. King when Mayor Hatcher was running, there was a group of black folk in Gary that told Dr. King, don't come to Gary. Dr. King was for Mayor Hatcher, and he was going to come to support Mayor Hatcher. And there was a group of black folk that got together, told Dr. King, don't come. So Isla, you're exactly right. Which is why a lot of preachers and pastors don't quote Dr. King until King's birthday. Until the birthday, I quote Dr. King throughout the year because there's so much relevance and insight. But they won't quote Dr. King until Dr. King's birthday, or until you start having the rebellions, and then they start quoting, Dr. King, that riots are the language of the unheard. Then they start quoting those quotes. But you're absolutely right. But that's why um, that's why I've been doing what we've been doing, trying to give some context to why we are the church, because we have been handed and we have been given a legacy that still needs to be active for liberation, as you can see. And so I'm hoping that you all will do something, even if you can't go to some of the celebrations for Juneteenth this Friday. Do something in your home, or or watch something. Like I say, that documentary, "The Uncomfortable Truth," that Isla shared with me. That's the incredible documentary that you can check out and share with other folk. But there are others, but do something to celebrate Juneteenth, because it's a testimony to the courage, I said, and the faith of Black people in Galveston, Texas, who said, we're not going to let it die. Even though they were opposed at it, even though slavery was still going on in pockets all around them, even though they were still being identified in a false ideology as less than white people, they still determined that we're going to celebrate liberation. And that is nothing but a testament. I'll text you and that the link to the documentary. I was only able to watch it on Amazon Prime. But yeah, that's a testimony to our people that it has today, it is very popular today. And to show you how popular it is, the current occupant of the White House, who don't care about nobody, decided he was going to change his rally date from the 19th to the 20th. Because the people around him started saying, that's Juneteenth, boss. That's Juneteenth. Now you're gonna upset Black folk enough. You don't want to upset them no more by doing this. And incidentally, he's following the script of Ronald Reagan when Ronald Reagan announced his run for the presidency back in 79, 80. Ronald Reagan did it from that place in Mississippi where Goodman, Cheney, and Swerner were murdered. And he did that to send a message to the racists that I'm on your side. And the current occupant is going to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, he switched the day. He should switch the place. Because y'all know what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that's why we keep coming back to that racism is the bloodstream, y'all. And it's a white problem. Black folk cannot be racist. You can be big. Black people can be bigoted, but we can't be racist. Because racism means privilege and power together. And don't let nobody, black or white, tell you anything different. Black folk cannot be racist. And so racism in the fabric of this country that sees Black people as less than caused what happened in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood District. What people call Black Wall Street, where Black folk were doing the doggone thing with their businesses. They weren't borrowing money from white folk. They were lending to themselves and were lending to some white areas around them. And that might have been part of the problem, because the white folk around them in their little poor areas got mad because these Black folk were doing well. And it's the only time where America bombed one of its own cities. The documentary, Betty, is called The Uncomfortable Truth. Let me see if I can type it in. And I can't type. So I hope that we will begin to we'll do something for Juneteenth, make it big. And you may have family members who don't celebrate Juneteenth. Call them and get on their nerve. Bug them. That's on them, but you keep bugging them. We got to bug our people, y'all. We got to be, that's it. The Uncomfortable Truth, Kathleen. That's it. Check it out, and we'll do a little more discussion on it. But we celebrate Juneteenth, and challenge some other Black person to recognize Juneteenth, because it is an exceptional day. I mean, exceptional celebration. and we want to keep it going. Don't let our struggle die out. Uh, there it is. Isla posted is on Amazon Prime. Anybody have any insight and questions? We're gonna wrap up. I really appreciate you all tuning in. Um, I thank God for you. While we are forced to confront the issues, um, we might as well bone up on um, the nuances and the details of it. Yeah, COVID-19 is still a reality. So if you go to one of the celebrations, make sure you wear your mask. Make sure you practice social distancing, because you know COVID is still real. I didn't get a chance to get into so much because this thing is so deep. Um, this thing is so deep that it can be overwhelming, but it also can be enlightening because you begin to understand that this is systemic, and when it's systemic, it is painful. That's why we can't allow things to go back to normal, because COVID-19 has showed that things in the old normal are very detrimental to Black folk in particular. There's no reason in the world why Black folk should be the one that are infected by COVID to the point of great sickness and death more than other folk. So we can't let things go back to normal. And believe me, a lot of people want things to go back to normal, y'all. A lot of Black politicians and a lot of Black preachers want things to go back to normal. And if that happens, we're going to be right back where we were before George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. We're going to be looking at this picture again. And so you got to figure out in your own personal space how you don't go back to normal, how you don't see things from a normal perspective, how you don't whisper when you're talking about white racism or the current occupant of the White House just because you're around white people. So we gotta get out of that ingrained self-deprecation. We gotta recognize that God did not create us less than anybody else. We are one of the greatest people. We are one of the greatest groups of people ever created by God. And that's right. Keep the narrative. So when people want to talk about rioting and they keep talking about, well, we want peaceful protest, what they really mean is they want passive protest. When you have to tell the people that you're protesting that you need permission from them to protest where you want to protest, it's not a protest, it's a party. Protests, remember, are supposed to disrupt things. And I know that's disrupting to middle-class Black people because middle-class Black people want to be comfortable. But protests are supposed to disrupt things, y'all. And so let's not go back to normal and let's not get off of the narrative. It's about Black lives. It's about, even after George Floyd and the world being in solidarity with protests all over the world. We can't let that die when people all over London and Britain and New Zealand and Australia and all these other places are saying this is too much. And they are in solidarity. We can't sit down and let things go back to, we got to keep it on the right narrative, and it's about Black lives. A person's life is more important than a piece of property. There is no piece of property that is equal to any Black life. Okay? And so we got to keep the narrative about Black lives, because after all of the attention. Guess what? You just had this brother in Atlanta get shot in the back, y'all. And just because he had a little too much to drink and he fell asleep in his car, it didn't mean he was supposed to be shot dead. Guess what? They didn't have to take him into custody. They could have said, look, man, we're going to call you an Uber. Or they could have said, look, man, just give me your keys. Call your wife, tell her come on get you. If she needs an Uber, we'll call an Uber to come get you. Just give me the keys. We're going to make sure you, or in fact, okay, we're going to put the car right here. You can sleep in this car as you want. We're going to take the keys. And when your loved one comes to get you, they can come and get the keys from us. They could have done a number of things. They didn't have to try to take the brother in custody. And just because he ran doesn't mean that he was supposed to be shot in the back, y'all. They could have drove him home. There's so many things they could have done. They could have said, look here, man, we're gonna drive you home. You're not under arrest. We're not gonna put no handcuffs on you, but we want to make sure you're safe. If they had been concerned about his life, they would have done something to help him and not something to try to harass him. But this happened after all of the attention. And guess what? They had discretion in this. There's something where police officers don't have discretion in. This was one that went where they had discretion in. They didn't have to do what they did. And guess what? When he ran, they could have said, we got your license, we got the car, run on. I ain't running after you. There was no reason to chase him. Even if he took a taser from one of the officers. And it could have said, run on. We'll catch up with you later. They could have done a whole lot of things instead of pull out a weapon and blow him away in the back. In the back. And this happened after all of the attention. So what does that tell you? That tells you it's not affecting the attention, the cries, the tears. Because when you have racism ingrained that black folk are less than white people, that doesn't matter. And so that's why things have to continue to be hot and heavy. And that's why we can't get off of the narrative. We can't get off of the narrative. We cannot get off of the narrative. So happy Juneteenth. If there are no other questions or anything, then we're gonna sign off for today. I hope it has been helpful. Can I tell you a secret? I don't get a chance to have this dialogue, and I know it's kind of a difficult dialogue. You all are texting and I'm talking, but it's still a dialogue, and it is affirming that there's a group of people that we can have this discussion, and we can just be straight, no chaser, as Thelonious Monk would say, because there's not a whole lot of places where I can have this. Now, I'll have it anywhere, I'll have it anywhere, but it's good to be around folk that appreciate it and that recognize that we've got to organize ourselves, because we can't let another generation come along and have to suffer the same things that we have when we could have done something about it. And so thank you all so much. Again, happy Juneteenth, and we're going to sign off. Have a blessed day and be encouraged. Know that God is on the side of oppressed people, and oppressed people who are fighting and straining and struggling against their oppressors. That God is on our side. That's the Bible. From Genesis to Revelation, it is about oppressed people fighting against oppressors. And those oppressed people are black people. So thank you. God bless you. Be encouraged. Oh, your line. Prayer line tomorrow at 5:45. And the prayer line number is area code 425-436-6365. Access code 833765. So join us on the prayer line tomorrow morning, y'all. Prayer line number, area code 425-436-6365. Access code 833765. Don't forget about the prayer line. 5:45 in the morning. We'll be done by 6:10 at the latest. But let's join and gather together in prayer, because prayer is our foundation, and that's the way we fight, y'all. That's the way we fight, through prayer, and how prayer animates us to take action. So God bless you. Thank you, Kathleen, for doing that. And y'all be encouraged, because I'm so glad the tomb was empty. Bye-bye.